what I have said over the last 20 or 30 years is that cooperation is not an interesting phenomenon in evolution, it's a fundamental principle. So Darwinian evolution recognizes two fundamental principles, mutation and selection. And I say we have to recognize three fundamental principles, mutation, selection, and cooperation. Mutation is that which gives rise to diversity. Selection acts on diversity. And cooperation is that which gives rise to higher levels of organization, which generates complexity. Cooperation gives rise to complexity. Cooperation for me is the master architect of the evolutionary process. And the interesting thing is, if you have a worldview where evolution only recognizes mutation and natural selection, then it is a very bleak world.
Hi, welcome to the Catholic Scientist Podcast. It's a production of the Society of Catholic Scientists. I'm one of the co-hosts, Dr. Dan Keebler, and I'm joined here with my co-host, Dr. Stephen Barr, who's the president of the Society. And our guest today is Dr. Martin Nowak from the University of Harvard University. This is the second of two podcasts that we're doing within. The first one we just would have been the last episode was does mathematics lead to God? And this one we're going to talk about a subject that's near and dear to my heart, evolution. And does evolution lead to God? So Dr. Nowak, he is professor of mathematics and biology at Harvard University. And he's known particularly for his work in mathematically modeling evolutionary processes. That's how I got to know his work, particularly the evolution of cooperation, evolution of language, cancer, viral evolution. And so that's sort of his background in evolutionary biology. And, we've had him at the Society of Catholic Scientists meeting give a talk on mathematics leading to God and evolution leading to God. And so this podcast, we want to sort of dive into that topic. And so, Martin, I wanted to start just asking you, when you first learned about evolution, did you ever see it as something that was challenging to your faith? Did you see, because so many people see this dichotomy between evolution leads you away from God. Where were you when you first, in that space, when you first sort of encountered evolutionary theory seriously?
So I never had a period where I thought that evolution would constitute an argument against God. So for me, evolution is a scientific principle that organizes living matter. And in the same way, you could talk about the forces of nature, gravitation, for example, organizing non-living matter, so on the universe on a large scale. So whenever I hear somebody say that evolution is an argument against God or evolution is a problem for me, I often ask them, do you have a problem with gravity? Because typically I don't meet people who have a problem with gravity. And I find that surprising. So for me, evolution and gravity, either you have a problem with both of them or with neither of them. And interestingly, Newton had a problem with gravity, because when Newton had an equation for gravity, he made this famous remark, hypothesis non fingo. So he paused for a brief moment and he wondered, now that he had a mathematical equation for gravity, has he taken away from God? And he came to the conclusion, no, he has not taken away from God, because he makes no hypothesis as to where there is gravity, why there is gravity. So his mathematics doesn't make it less divine in some sense. He just describes it.
Yeah. No, and that's the thing about evolution. I think in your work, you do a lot to unite sort of mathematics and evolution, right? So a lot of people think, and myself included, when I started in biology, one of the reasons I went into biology because I didn't have to do as much math as you did for physics or chemistry. And I think that was a major handicap that I've been trying to overcome for the rest of my career.
Because my mentor in Oxford, who was a very famous scientist, he started out as a physicist, so jokingly, he was then the later president of the Royal Society. He was Lord Mayor of Oxford. Jokingly, he always said, A biologist is somebody who wanted to be a scientist but wasn't good enough in math to be a physicist.
That's right.
Ooh.
Yeah, we all have physics envy, right?
Those are fighting words.
But the funny thing is, this was a joke because it applied to himself somehow. He started off as a physicist, but his great impact came in biology.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, and getting to evolution, one of the things that that you talk about is how mathematics is a tool for not only understanding evolution, but in some sense drives or guides it. So first, maybe you could just talk about how evolution, or how mathematics is useful for understanding evolution. Yeah.
Yeah, so for me, the beautiful thing about evolution, of course, is an organizing principle of all of biology. So I like the statement, nothing in biology makes sense if not seen in the eyes of evolution. Um, but then when we come to the question, what is evolution actually? The beautiful thing is, over the decades, it has become something very mathematical. And there have been endless verbal debates in evolution. For example, the unit of selection or inclusive fitness theory. All of these debates go away if you look at the mathematical equation. And this is what I find beautiful. So the mathematical equation is the truth. And I always try to compare it like this. Once you have the equations of Newton, you do not just talk about the motion of the planets. You cannot have a discussion of the solar system without using those equations. And we have reached the same status in biology when it comes to evolution.
Yeah.
Evolution fundamentally is mathematics. And the mathematics of evolution is simple. I mean, it can get very complicated, but the foundation is simple, and it can be studied, and it is clarifying. And
Yeah.
that's what I find beautiful.
Yeah, so you talk about the unit of selection. So there's endless debates, about what's the foundational unit of selection. Oh, it's the gene, it's the organism. Oh, you can have group selection. Other people say, no, you really can't have group selection. The debates going back and forth about this. But you would argue that at whether it's at the gene or the organism or at the group, the mathematics behind selection that's the reality that's driving evolution.
Yes,
You can describe that selection mathematically, whether it's at the organismal level or at the group level, or is that where what you would argue?
sense, I would say that the debates go away once we look at the mathematical equation, because the mathematical equation just describes what is the case.
Okay.
Can I ask a question about that? So I've heard these debates as a non-biologist reading about biology, and I read one thing, and you have a biologist saying it's clearly, it's the gene that is sort of the unit of selection of and other people, and you can't have group selection, and I hear people contradict. Are you saying that the equations governing evolution show you that there are some situations in which it's useful to think of the group as the unit of selection, and other situations where it's useful to think of the individual, and so on? But these are all just limiting cases, but it's always more complicated than that? Or
And so in some sense, the way how I would put it is, you have to specify the evolutionary question that you have in mind. And then you can write down the equations that describes that question.
Mhm.
And then you might discover, for example, that selection acts on different levels here simultaneously. So I
I
call this multi-level selection. That's possible. It's possible that in the problem that you're studying, there is multi-level selection emerging. But it's possible also that it is not there because you have completely misinterpreted in words the situation that you want to study. So, for example, when we have a model for the origin of eusociality of social insects, the most straightforward model is not a group selection model. The most straightforward model is just an equation about reproduction. And that equation about reproduction takes into account whether a mother insect lays an egg and whether the daughter immediately leaves or whether the daughter stays with the nest to help her for some time before she leaves, or maybe not at all. And if you write down those equations that describe what the problem is about, all you see is natural selection. All you see is population genetics. All you see is reproduction. And that is where the debates are resolved. And I find that very beautiful. So many of those debates are only there because people don't understand the underlying mathematics.
So once you have the underlying mathematics of, say, eusociality, so these insects that have this interesting sort of genetics situation, where you have just one, like a queen bee, reproducing, and you have these infertile females. So you're saying once you model what's going on with each one of the individual offspring and where they end up and so forth, that then shows whether and how this sort of thing can evolve or be selected for versus just sort of a standard
And also what
reproduction.
is. So actually an interesting example from physics. If you don't have the equations of Newton, you can ask endlessly, you can argue endlessly, is the Earth in the center, is the sun in the center? It's just a question of coordinate system. Once you have the equation of Newton, you realize that there's no discussion about that anymore. There is like an elliptic orbit, and then there is the focal point, which is closer to the object that has the more mass. So, something like that,
But
So
to
the
take
same we have here.
to take another example from physics, so is light a particle or is light a wave, or is the electron a particle or electron a wave? When you talk just in terms of words, and the words are suggesting some sort of intuitive model, I mean, it's true that the equation ultimately you have to discuss things at the level of the mathematics and the equations. But there are situations in which, if you model, say, an electron as a particle, that's good, and that gives you the right answer. But in other situations, that's not going to work. And then there are other situations where, if you treat it as a wave, you're going to get the right answer. As you say, it depends on what question you're asking. But then if you treat it as a particle, you're going to get the wrong answer. So, I mean, there's truth. That's what I'm saying. Is there situations where some particular model of selection is basically right and giving you the right answer, but it's not the whole story, that the
Yes,
exact and then complete stories in the
yes,
equations.
you could definitely say that.
But the words aren't a waste of time. The words in some situations can actually be a fairly good intuitive. Why are the equations giving you this result? Well, there can be an intuitive explanation based on some sort of a verbal explanation. It might
Yes, so
capture.
words are always good in our field also, if they are about equations.
Okay.
The problem is if you have words without equations, or what also happened in our field, that you have equations that mean nothing. These equations just written down for the purpose of writing some math symbols, but there is no meaning. That can happen in our field. It's sort of, it's rarer and rarer, but it's sometimes possible. But so this big debate out there that I was part of, unfortunately, in some sense, it's not so much group selection versus kin selection. It was really the essence of kin selection itself and the essence of inclusive fitness. So
Maybe for the non-biologists,
Yeah.
maybe Dan, you could back up and explain this question of the paradox of, like, why is it sometimes people cooperate or animals cooperate instead of fighting, and the idea of group selection, how that might help, or, I mean, because this might go over the heads of some people, I mean, what's being talked about.
yeah, I can also.
Yeah, I mean, Martin, if you explain like the difference between kin selection and, say, just group selection, and why you think maybe group selection is a better way of,
Like for understanding altruism, because that's a
Yeah,
lot of.
so in some sense, if we back up a little bit again, Darwin actually said, if you show me a trait in a species that is exclusively there to help another species, that would be a problem. That would be a challenge for my theory. So in essence, he understands a little bit about the tension that is there of what later then has been called evolution of cooperation. How do you get natural selection to favor cooperation? Or in another way, Darwin writes, why would it be that in social insects, the worker does not reproduce? The bee or the ant does not reproduce. So therefore, her fitness is essentially zero. Or natural selection, it's very hard to understand how natural selection would act on her if she has no offspring. And yet, she is perfectly adapted to the task that she is doing. How does that work? Darwin asks. And in some sense, the answer to this question was given much later, once we had a mathematical machinery to write down equations of population genetics that deal with social evolution, for example. And the first answer that was attempted was really the following. And this is an interesting answer, and this was done by Bill Hamilton in his PhD thesis, which was published in 1964. And this came known under inclusive fitness theory. And inclusive fitness theory is now the following attempt. The worker really has no offspring of herself, but she is related to the queen, and the queen has offspring. So maybe there is a calculation possible where the overall fitness of the worker could take into account her offspring, which are 0, plus the offspring of the queen, multiplied by the relatedness between the worker and the queen. And that's the proposition of inclusive fitness. And the idea then basically is that every act of cooperation in the biological world can be explained with this inclusive fitness. This is really the attempt of those people who like this theory. And the theory was greatly boosted by Richard Dawkins, actually, in The Selfish Gene. He defends that theory, the Higgs, without sort of understanding the mathematics, of course, or without understanding the mathematical problems. But for quite some time, the theory was strongly advocated. And if you would have asked me until about 2004, I would have presented it as one of the important theories of biology. And so the idea is, if I help you, then I might reduce my own fitness, but I increase your fitness. And if we are related, this may work out overall because my inclusive fitness then goes up. So Holden said, I will jump into the river to save 2 brothers or 8 cousins.
As long as your genes, they have enough genes that are similar to you, your genes are doing well, even if they're packaged in somebody else. So
that's kind of the idea. So the idea sounds very plausible. And so the question is, how far can we go with that idea? Because it turned out that whenever people attempt to calculate inclusive fitness, it's actually much harder than you could possibly have imagined. And so I give you now an example. So let's suppose, again, we take Holden's example. There is this man in the river about to drown. And you and I, we are standing there by the river, and neither of us alone could actually save him. If one of us jumps in, we will also die. But if we both kind of go together, maybe with a boat or something like this, we save him. So let's suppose you and I work together to save him. Then he comes out of the river. Then he has 3 kids afterwards. Now, how do you distribute those 3 kids over you and over me? So you can't say half of them go to you, half of them go to me, because what we did to him was not additive. It's a typical example of a non-additive interaction. So you and I were both necessary to generate this reproductive event. Neither of us could have done it alone. And then the inclusive fitness calculation breaks down because inclusive fitness requires pairwise additive interactions. And so that is the interesting thing. So we were able to show, actually, maybe starting in 2008, 2009, that inclusive fitness theory, you can do it sometimes, but typically in biology, because in biology we have to deal with nonlinearity and with non-additive effects, typically there is no such thing as inclusive fitness. And that is actually a good result, because inclusive fitness is enormously complicated to calculate. And most people talk about it, but couldn't possibly calculate it in any situation that they're talking about. And now the good news is there is no need for inclusive fitness, because whatever you want to know about such a situation, you calculate it differently. And this is how you calculate it. You have to postulate there is a genetic machinery that underlies the altruistic act. So again, going back to our example, you and I, we have something in us that makes us aware that there's another human being in danger, and that will allow us to do something to help that person. So there is kind of a genetic predisposition for this kind of altruistic interaction. And now the calculation is a very straightforward calculation of population genetics. Does this gene increase or reduce in abundance given the interactions that we are studying? And the mistake was to try to analyze it on the level of the individual.
Mhm.
Does the worker have an individual inclusive fitness which is positive? That's the mistake. The correct thing is there a gene out there such that this gene increases in abundance if the worker does not have her own offspring but helps the queen reproduce? Is this favored by natural selection or is it opposed by natural selection?
Mm.
That's the question. And that's all there is to it. And this is what I published in a paper in Nature in 2010, for example, which was on the front cover of Nature. But it was part of this controversy then, or at least that the inclusive fitness camp somehow didn't want to accept that kind of state of affairs.
Yeah. No, that's it's very interesting because one of the things that you talk about in that paper and others is just the idea of ways that you lead into cooperation evolutionarily. So, particularly like group selection, like in groups, and how to groups competing against different groups, how altruism can emerge or cooperation can evolve there. But it's also very complicated. It's not a simple thing because you do need to you have to you have a group of everybody's acting altruistically, and so maybe the whole population does better. You have another population where they don't act altruistically, so they don't do as well. But as soon as you get cheaters in the population, in the altruistic population, freeloaders, then you've got the punishers, and so it is so group selection does become complicated too, does it not? Or is it? But it's still calculable.
Okay, so yeah, let me. The problem that we have to deal with is the following. What is cooperation? Cooperation means that there is an individual. That individual could be a cell, or it could be a bacterium, it could be a gene, it could be an animal, it could be a human being. So that individual pays a cost in order to help another. And that other individual is a competitor. So that is what cooperation is about. And what I have said over the last 20 or 30 years is that cooperation is not an interesting phenomenon in evolution, it's a fundamental principle. So Darwinian evolution recognizes two fundamental principles, mutation and selection. And I say we have to recognize three fundamental principles, mutation, selection, and cooperation. Mutation is that which gives rise to diversity. Selection acts on diversity. And cooperation is that which gives rise to higher levels of organization, which generates complexity. Cooperation gives rise to complexity. Cooperation for me is the master architect of the evolutionary process. And the interesting thing is, if you have a worldview where evolution only recognizes mutation and natural selection, then it is a very bleak world. And that's what I describe in my books. Also in this recent book, Within and so on. Because then everything is just competition. Everybody is just out for himself, everybody against everybody else. And it's always a struggle. From the beginning to end, on every level, it's a struggle. And in my opinion, that struggle gave rise to the world wars that we saw in the 20th century, where this idea of natural selection was even applied to countries or to nations, as of fighting for survival against each other, without any other consideration. Once we have cooperation, we realize that this is not the end of the story. Cooperation is a fundamental principle of evolution. Without cooperation, we wouldn't be here.
Right.
So our ancestors were not the toughest ones that won every fight. Our ancestors were also the ones that were the most successful at cooperation.
Yeah.
And that, I think, prepares us now for the human realm where we are supposed to love each other. So this is why cooperation for me is so important.
Yeah.
And now the next step would be, we realize that natural selection and cooperation, that's at variance, that's kind of at odds, if nothing else is there. So natural selection favors cheaters, as you say, defectors, unless something is there. So what needs to be there? I ask myself, what needs to be there for natural selection to help cooperation? And this is a paper that I published in 2006 in Science, and I call this mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation. So there are 5 mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation. And there are thousands of papers really on this question, how do we get cooperation? And I classified all of these papers into 5 categories. And so the first mechanism is direct reciprocity. Direct reciprocity is we have repeated interactions. I help you and you help me. So maybe we can talk more about each of those mechanisms in turn, but I just give you those mechanisms now. The second mechanism is indirect reciprocity. Indirect reciprocity is I help somebody, and maybe somebody sees it and thinks that I'm a helpful person who deserves help. It's like the Good Samaritan or something like
Yeah,
this.
right. Yeah.
And then the next mechanism is spatial reciprocity. So this is cooperators form clusters, and neighbors or friends help each other. And this can go in space, in a bacterial colony, or it can go on a social network, my friends. So this is a very important force for cooperation, this spatial clustering of cooperators. The fourth mechanism is group selection. And group selection is the idea that if there's a competition between groups, then if one group has more cooperators, it may win against a group that has fewer cooperators. Even though inside the group, there is sort of this tendency to defect. So we have selection on 2 levels, inside against cooperation, between groups for cooperation. And then finally, the mechanism is kin selection. And for me, kin selection is based on the idea that I recognize close kin and I behave accordingly. So this is the idea, I will jump into the river to save 2 brothers or 8 cousins. And so kin selection for me is a valid mechanism for the evolution of cooperation. As long as we realize that the dominant mathematical theory that had been used for it, inclusive fitness, has this problem.
Yeah. And it's worth stating before maybe we jump into some of those that because you mentioned how cooperation has to be one of these major principles of evolution. Because if you look back and trace what's happened evolutionarily, and I'll let you add on to this, but you see like going from a bunch of chemicals to the original protocell, there's a cooperation of molecules. As you go from a simple cell to a cell with a bunch of organelles, there's a cooperation there. You go from a single cell organism to a multicellular organism, there has to be a level of cooperation there. If you go to an animal society there, and then up to human society. So it's not just, some people say, oh yeah, maybe cooperation evolved in late on in the evolutionary process, it evolved with humans and so on. No, it's been there all along. It's a fundamental aspect. So you have to have some way of explaining it. You're not going to be able to explain evolution because it's the whole thing. It's not just a little piece here.
Yes, that's exactly right. So in my theories, I also make the point that cooperation is necessary for an origin of life. So even before an origin of life, we need cooperation.
If I were a devil's advocate, or at least a Dawkins advocate, or something, what would stop me from saying, basically what you have is mutations, and you have a competition for resources, and whose offspring are going to outnumber other people's offspring and get more of the resource. It's a competition, but the cooperation can be a very good strategy to win the competition. And why invoke it as another principle alongside of competition? Couldn't you take a kind of reductionist attitude and say, yeah, the basic thing going on is a competition, a struggle to survive, and cooperation is a good way. I mean, even in international politics, countries often cooperate in order to defeat some other country, right? I mean, the cooperation, your friends are often useful because you have an enemy. So it's not that they're antithetical to each other somehow.
So I don't see it. I don't see it as something that takes away from competition. So
Right.
I don't describe it as something that says, "Hey, instead of competition, let's focus on cooperation."
Right.
In the same way as I don't say, instead of mutation, let's focus on selection,
Right.
even though sometimes that can be a question. So I say there is a hierarchy of principles. the most important one is mutation generating variation.
Mhm.
Once you have variation, then selection can act. So selection cannot act before you have variation. So somehow selection is then on the next level. Once
Mhm.
you have selection, there's the possibility for all-out competition or cooperation.
Mhm.
But therefore, it's the third level.
I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
and one of the things I think that in your work you've done sort of mathematically, just even like with cancer and viral, you recognize that I think often one of the dangers of mathematizing biology is that you lose some of the the interaction. So if you say, oh, this what's the selection I get for this gene or against this gene using some of so the Hardy-Weinberg equation, some of the sort of basic genetic equations for evolution is to you 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 oversimplify it just so that people can understand it, but then you miss all the various interactions. Is that all organisms are cooperating or with others to some extent, where they're producing things, whether it's gases or nutrients that other organisms are going to need. So it's a principle that we're competing for resources, but we're also reliant. We're dependent upon these others, and the more we can cooperate with them, in a sense, organisms, and that's why you get these diverse ecosystems where that are follow these nonlinear dynamics where you have all, and then one little tweak could cause it to collapse. But because it is so complicated, and it's not so much it's taken away from competition, but it's recognizing competition happens in a certain very complex situation. It's not, because we view competition, it's me against Steve. Me and Steve are going to arm wrestle. It's one thing. It's simple. We're just going to compete. But it's competition between organisms is much more complicated than that. Particularly you have to take a lot of things into account. Um,
You've already won our competition, Dan. You have 6 kids and I have 5.
so evolutionarily, uh,
But sorry to derail you.
yeah. So you talk about how math is the equations shed light on what's actually going on evolutionarily, and how evolution follows mathematical laws, right? So, what does that, you know, does that tell you that evolution is predictable in a sense, or is it telling you, because a lot of people say, oh, there's mathematical laws undergirding it. It should be predictable, like Newton's laws, they should be predictable. I can tell where the planets are going to be in the orbit. But the thing about evolution is that it seems to be unpredictable in many circumstances, and it leads to surprising things. So how do you um, sort of fit those two things together, or am I way off here in my understanding of math, which is quite possible?
So sometimes evolution is predictable. And an example would be a study that we did on targeted cancer therapy, where there was a new drug that was developed for colon cancer. And it had great success if used in the right patients. So that drug could only be used if a particular oncogene was not mutated.
Okay.
And so people were screened and to make sure that the oncogene is not mutated, and then the drug was given. And then typically the drug had a tremendous effect, unseen basically in this type of cancer before. So the cancer went down dramatically. But then after 24 weeks or so, the cancer came back. At a rapid pace, the cancer came back. And then the people sequenced, and then they found that the oncogene was mutated. That oncogene that previously was not mutated is now mutated. So when we analyzed the data, we could precisely explain that the mutation was already present at the time when treatment started, because this is how mutation works in a cancer that has like 1 billion cells. We can calculate the frequency of the mutation that is present at that time, and we can predict exactly the time at which it would be detectable. So it was with mathematical certainty, we could predict treatment failure here. And that was very impressive for the cancer people, because it is a mathematical fact why this treatment fails in this particular way. And therefore, the same argument actually we made for HIV long before. And that led in the HIV very quickly to the adoption of the combination treatment. So you cannot cure HIV with one drug. You have to give a cocktail of drugs.
Yeah.
And so this is an example where evolution is predictable. But overall, we are dealing with a very complicated situation. And so overall, it is not surprising that one could not have a theory that would somehow make a statement for something that happens in 1,000,000 years from now or so in macroevolution. However, that is not satisfactory. I don't find that state in biology satisfactory. I want biology to be much more like physics. So, for example, in physics, we can look at a star and we can know the type of star and we can make a prediction about the processes that this star will undergo, the different stages in the life. And physicists might then be able to say this star has an expected lifetime of 10 billion years and then it will become a, a nova or something like this. So physicists can make such predictions. And it would be desirable if in evolutionary biology we could also make such predictions. For example, if we could say an origin of life, might take about 500 million years, and then it might take 1.8 billion years to get like the higher cells or so to come about, and then intelligent life will come in 4 billion years. It would be very nice to have such a theory. But it might be that we are far from it. But one day it might be possible. But the important thing is that all of science is based on natural laws, and these natural laws are based on randomness. So this is what fascinated me when I was a student at the University of Vienna, the statement by Schrödinger. The statement was, it is overwhelmingly obvious that the fundamental basis of all natural law is randomness.
At the basis of all natural law, you say?
Is randomness, yes. And that, for me, in the philosophical sense, means the following. For a scientist who is an observer in the flow of time, randomness is the tool of choice. So our best descriptions of evolution are probabilistic descriptions. We also use randomness as a tool. It's always based on stochastic processes. We have deterministic processes also, but they are only an approximation. The real thing is always the stochastic process. The same in physics, I would say. The real thing is the quantum mechanical equation. And that does not mean that the thing is unpredictable for somebody who is outside the flow of time. That is for God. So the randomness that we encounter in the natural sciences is not at variance with divine providence. And this was already understood very well by Thomas Aquinas, in my opinion.
Yeah. That's one of those things that people with evolution get confused about and think, well, if it's stochastic, if it's random, therefore God can't have any role in it, and that's not the case at all. But thinking of that in the predictability, I just want to get your thoughts on this. I know Simon Conway Morris talks about this, and the idea being that, well, yeah, it's not necessarily predictable in the sense that you can predict where a planet is in its orbit because there's a stochastic nature of it. Like, when is this mutation going to happen? When might this recombination event occur? We can never predict that. When might this specific environmental perturbation occur? But over time, the things that will emerge, we can predict because they have to follow the laws of physics and a certain chemistry. And so, but when they emerge, so we couldn't predict with certainty when things, what would happen in 1 million years or 2 million years, but we can't predict, well, these are the type of things that could emerge because they have to follow the mathematics of chemistry and physics and these fundamental laws. I mean, would you subscribe to that type of view, or would you think evolution is even more predictable or less predictable than that?
I mean, if we have to always distinguish, if we talk about a specific question about evolution, for example, will this virus or will this cancer or this bacterial population develop resistance against this particular drug? This is a very specific, almost simple question, even though it's complicated enough, but it could be. As opposed to, for example, what can we say about the unfolding of life on a planetary scale over a period of 2 billion years? These are very different. For me, these are very different questions. And And I have also worked on this planetary evolution together with Andy Knowles, who is really an expert on the history of Earth and early life and young Earth, as he calls it, the first 3 billion years, he calls the young Earth. And so,
Yeah.
and the fascinating thing, what I learned in the collaboration with him, is that there is really the possibility that the physical structure of the planet, plate tectonics, volcanic activity, formation of continents, breakup of the supercontinent, that these physical events really guided what happened on the macroscopic scale in evolution. And so that evolution somehow is responding to the environment that is provided. And it's not that we are waiting for evolution to discover something, and evolution is slow in making that discovery. It's rather evolution is ready if you call for it.
Yeah.
And a very interesting example is the oxygenation.
Right.
Of the
Exactly.
atmosphere.
Yeah.
So the oxygenation of the atmosphere, the great oxygenation event 2.4 billion years ago, was somehow, it is always described as it was caused by cyanobacteria. They release oxygen as a waste product, and that leads to the oxygenation of the atmosphere. So what is true about the story is that, yes, cyanobacteria produce oxygen, and that's the oxygen we have in the atmosphere. But what is a bit more complicated about the story is the fact that cyanobacteria were present 300 million years before the great oxygenation event. So for 300 million years, they existed there at a very low level, and oxygen did not rise.
Right.
And then at that moment, what happened was the formation of a supercontinent. And that formation of a supercontinent upset the amount of phosphate that was available in the oceans. It increased the amount of phosphate. And in the competition between cyanobacteria and purple bacteria, the balance was now shifted in favor of the cyanobacteria. And then the cyanobacteria started to increase in abundance. And because they increased in abundance, they released even more oxygen. But the first step was really made by the planet forming continents. And I find that super interesting.
Yeah.
So an evolutionary model by itself would not have predicted the time scale if it wasn't for the planet to make
Yeah.
the...
Right. So that is an event that isn't necessarily biological evolution can't predict that when that's going to happen. But when you do give it an opportunity, that's when you have a whole new set of possibilities that the organisms can shuffle and
as we
discuss.
have an oxygen, the oxygen has now increased 1,000-fold. The next amazing thing that happens is the emergence of higher cells. So why did it take so long from the origin of life, when then it was a world full of bacteria, for the first eukaryotic cell to emerge? And the first eukaryotic cell, what was it? It was a bacterium swallowing another bacterium, and that bacterium that was swallowed became the mitochondrium, the mitochondrial leaf.
Yeah.
And that mitochondrium is there to allow aerobic life, aerobic metabolism. So previously, there was no oxygen. So you couldn't have had a life form that uses oxygen to burn sugar to get energy. But now this is possible because there's oxygen. So again, the arrival of the eukaryotic cell is a consequence of the oxygen accumulation.
How long did it take? Was there a time lag? That is, can one determine how long it took for the eukaryotic cells to appear once
So
the oxygen?
the oldest ones that we see in the fossil record, to my information, but I'm not really the expert, there's 1.8 billion years ago.
Yeah.
So it's 600 million years after. But it could be that the earlier fossils didn't show up. So the origin of life itself, we don't know when it was. Some people want to say as early as 4 billion years ago. And then there are some propositions that traces of life were present in certain rocks 3.8 billion years ago, and they are debated. But every expert in that field accepts 3.5 billion years ago. 3.5 billion years ago, there are traces in the rocks which cannot be explained other than by the presence of bacterial life on Earth. So everybody accepts that by 3.5 billion years, we have a world full of bacteria. Earth itself came into existence 4.5 billion years ago. So from the formation of the Earth until a world of bacteria, it took approximately a billion years. We don't know when the origin of life really was.
Mhm.
And so then it took 1.7 billion years for the eukaryotic cell. So this is 1.8 billion years ago, we have the first eukaryotic cell. We still have nothing that we would call macroscopic life. So any visitor from outer space who would have looked on Earth to look for life would have needed a microscope to see what was going on. There's nothing that you could actually see. So then there was a second oxygenation event, and the second oxygenation event started maybe 800 million years ago. And at the end of that is the Cambrian explosion. So at the end of that, for the first time, we have macroscopic life.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that you see these big long, and I've heard people argue this. That hey, you see this big long. Most of the history of Earth is, single-celled, simple organisms. We just sort of got lucky that it moved on to more complex organisms and so forth. So therefore, God, couldn't have had anything to do with this. It seems like it was just luck, that we could just still be stuck, say we never form a supercontinent, we never get these phosphate plumes, we still are stuck at a single cell organisms. In what people will make that case. What is, what would be your response to that? Because you say evolution is leading to God. It's, you have this cooperation preparing us for, this cooperation and love, in a sense, that you've said before. So how would you argue, or respond to that?
I mean, to call something luck, and then to use this as an argument against God, that's very strange for me. So, for example, I'm very lucky that I'm sitting here having a conversation with the two of you. And that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. For me, that means God has brought us together here. I'm so happy because I'm so grateful that God has given me this blessing of this moment. So it's the same. I mean, that whatever we see out there, for a theist, for somebody who believes in God, of course, everything that is done by God. And the important thing to realize, that God is not in competition with any scientific explanation. That's the important thing. So if we explain gravity, if we explain something like evolution, then an explanation, this mathematical description of those things doesn't take away from God.
Right.
It underlines the greatness of God, because He has also given us the ability to understand aspects of those things. So I find it very beautiful.
Yeah.
I have this I have this feeling that that sometimes when the subject of evolution comes up, people lose their common sense.
Exactly.
So I mean, if you were playing a game of poker with somebody and you got dealt a full house, and you said, "Boy, I'm really lucky," or they said, "Boy, the probability of getting dealt a full house is 1 in," and you can calculate that if the deck is properly randomized. And you say, "Oh, the probability of getting a full house is this, and a straight flush is this, and a two of a kind is this." No one's, "Are you an atheist? You're talking about probabilities and luck?" But nobody says that in everyday life. But it wouldn't even say that in physics. If you said, "Oh, the probability of this happening, this planet hitting this other planet," but the minute it's in evolution, they immediately lose their common sense and say, "Oh, you're talking about chance. You're talking about luck. You must be making an argument against God," which is,
Yeah.
I don't know what it is about the topic of evolution that makes people lose their bearings.
No,
But do you find the same thing? I mean,
it's exactly that. And that's Martin pointed out, like Thomas Aquinas worked this out well before evolutionary theory came on the scene. And
yeah.
that's the thing. Life is full of chance events and stochastic events. But it's
So
only
for
in
me,
evolution where they seem to lose their head about them.
Yeah.
the interesting historical question for me is, at the time when evolutionary theory was proposed by Darwin and by others in England, there was apparently some kind of conflict between evolution and those people who believed in Christianity or who were faithful to the Anglican Church. So there was definitely a kind of conflict there. And so far, nobody has explained to me the underlying philosophy, because those people who now see evolution as a problem, they could not have been instructed, for example, in the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas.
No.
Because had they known about the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, they would not have seen a problem with evolution, in my opinion. In my opinion, Thomas Aquinas would have been delighted to hear about the theory of evolution, and it would not have changed anything about his perspective of God. And the same, of course, is true of Augustine. So there was a kind of theology floating around, I think, that would say, let's look at the world around us. You know, we have trees, we have animals and clouds, and all of this was made by God, and this is an argument for God. And how could you have all of this if it wasn't for God? So this was a kind of theology then that was undermined or it itself felt undermined, you know, by a formulation in terms of the theory of evolution. And I'm mystified by that, actually.
Yeah, that is it was the direct creation. It was such an idea in the early 1800s. It was like, oh, God's providence is shown directly by the fact that He created a squirrel in this fashion. You know,
Yeah, maybe this was
I
the
think
theological argument.
I think a couple of reasons. Um, yeah, I mean, I just finished reading this lengthy book by Kenneth Kemp, who spoke at our conference, the same one you just spoke at, Martin. And he wrote this very long book, which is sort of the definitive book on the history of Catholic Church's reaction to evolution, but similar things in the Protestant world. Partly it was because they were worried about the actual text of Genesis and trying to, well, Genesis seems to say that certain things, especially the human beings, are somehow portrayed as directly created. So it says the earth brought forth certain living things, but when it describes the creation of man, it seems to make God act in a more direct way. And so I think it was partly the way they were reading the book of Genesis, but a lot of the fear had to do with human evolution because they felt it was somehow degrading to human beings, that the evolution meant that we were just beasts, we were just animals, that there's the law of the jungle, that we were no different really from other animals. And it wasn't helped by the fact that many atheists were using evolution to attack religion. I think a lot of it was that some of the early evolutionists were using evolution as a basis of arguments, as is happening today, as a club to beat, to argue against religion. So many religious people, ordinary people who were not philosophers, they saw these atheists using evolution to attack religion, and they immediately assumed, oh, it must be something that's harmful to religion, and they reacted to a large extent.
Yes, to this I want to say that even in evolution, humans are completely unique, and this is what I find beautiful. And evolutions are unique, humans are unique because what is it that is different between us and all other animal species? And this is human language. So I've also worked on the evolution of human language. And I would say there were three major events in the history of the universe that we know of. And this is the origin of the universe itself, and that gives rise to all of physics. That instantiates kind of physics, and that instantiates chemistry with the nucleosynthesis in the stars. And then the origin of life, which instantiates biology. And then the origin of language. So the origin of language in humans, for me, that's an event as big as the origin of the universe or the origin of life, because it gives rise to something completely different. It gives rise to a species that sees for the first time absolute truth. So evolution gives rise to language. The first thing that I think we do, this is what I write in my books, the first thing we do is we pray. And in that sense, evolution brings us to God.
Yeah. You talk about, there with the evolution of language, humans being unique, but we're part of evolution, but we have this unique nature. So, going back, just so we're getting to the end, just to ask you about altruism. So altruism, like trying to understand that, as it emerges, is it different? I mean, these evolutionary models can work for understanding altruism in other organisms. and they can work to some extent in understanding humans, but they can't fully explain human altruism, right? Because there's something the humans that goes beyond,
Yes,
just those these
exactly.
altruistic models of like indirect reciprocity. And sure, we do that, and sometimes I act nicely to somebody because I want my reputation to be better, so somebody can help me later on. We do those things selfishly, but there are certain just truly altruistic acts that humans do that you can't explain through some
Yes,
model.
there's an interesting development of that story. So I have used, like many other people in that field, I have used the word altruism and cooperation almost side by side until we had a program with Sarah Coakley at Harvard University where we invited philosophers and historians and biologists and mathematicians to come and give talks on the topic of human altruism. And then philosophers actually persuaded me not to use the word altruism anymore for what we were doing. And since then, I haven't used it. So
Okay,
I've
that's
flicked
good.
the word cooperation. And the reason is because they think, at least the origins of the term, is that altruism is an act done by humans which is based on love,
Okay,
motivated by love. And I like this a lot. And at the same time, Sarah Coakley and others have asked me, for example, in all my explanations of cooperation, in the end, it is about winning. It's about winning and it's about losing. So yes, I'm a very cooperative strategy. Also, this strategy now can also forgive, and it is very generous in some sense, but it is winning. It is winning.
yeah, yeah,
So she asked me, what is the game that is actually won by a saint? Which game does a saint win? And my response was that in our analysis, typically we analyze action. So either you cooperate or you defect, but I don't analyze the motive behind your action. And I would like to develop a game theory that is not only based on action, but is based on the motive behind the action. And that is what I'm working on right now, actually. And I call this a game theory of love. So this is not a game theory of strategic winning and losing. It is a game theory about the right attitude or the ultimate, the ultimate.
yeah.
I mean,
So
one,
how do you evaluate that model in terms of well,
uh,
yeah,
We have various approaches in this. And one interesting approach for me was, there are many things that I have tried that did not work. But one thing that actually did work is the idea, can I think of an individual in a population that is not as short-sighted as everybody else,
okay,
but leads to a very positive outcome? So specifically, I am modeling mathematically a population of greedy learners. So these individuals, they are constantly trying to improve their strategy of cooperation or defection in a way to maximize their own payoff. So it could be that they find cooperation, it could be that they don't find cooperation, but in any case, they do the normal thing. They do the normal thing, which we would call game theory, which would be the Nash equilibrium. So they always find the Nash equilibrium, and so on, it goes on. Let's place in that population one individual that has another goal. And her goal is, here we come to my book again, her goal is, what could I do such that everybody is better off in the long run? And so the amazing thing is we show the possibility of this scenario. One teacher, we call it, in a population of thousands of greedy people can make a difference such that without her, it's total defection. And with her, it's complete cooperation. And nobody knows that she's even present. So for me, that's the action of a saint.
when it comes to cooperation, altruism, one, there's going back to, was it Haldane who said, oh no, who was it who said, I'll jump in the river for
Holden, yeah.
Haldane, for two brothers or
8 cousins.
or eight cousins and so on. It's one thing to love or to help someone you're unrelated to, a complete stranger.
Mhm.
I think something that Christ taught, which I think goes way beyond what seems to have any sort of utility, is loving your enemies.
Yes, so
And it's
that
not
is
just loving strangers, but loving your enemies sort of makes no sense from a worldly
yes. So
perspective.
that is something that I discuss in this book within, and that is a very important concept, and I think almost unique to Christianity. That the mandate to love your enemies, and I'm fascinated by this. And I all my life I was actually wanting to understand this, and the first possibility of an understanding dawned on me when I read Teresa of Avila, The Interior Castle. And there it became clear to me that she had reached a state where she was so close to God, that she felt so loved by God, that she understood that everything that would happen in her life would happen for a reason that was permitted by God. So if she has enemies, then this is what God allows to happen for the betterment of her soul. And she can be truly grateful to them because they are tools sent by God to make her better. And also, they may not have reached the level that she has reached, and therefore she has compassion for them, and that she prays for them that they may also find the same level. And that for me is really the exploration.
Yeah.
And this is what is beautiful. And why do we have this in Christianity? We have this in Christianity because we have the perfect person, the perfect individual. We have this concept of the perfect love because of Jesus. And
Yeah.
in other religions, you don't necessarily have this.
Yeah, that's a great way to end there, Martin. If you want to just talk a little bit about your two books, but Believe and Within, these very much philosophical, theological reflections on topics you mentioned Within there for a moment, but you can just show
And so
talk about
the
that.
other book here is Beyond, and I wrote these books. I wanted to write about science and Christianity and religion more generally, and this was the first book that I wrote, and Within is the second book. And I'm trying to talk about these scientific topics in the context where people discuss. So there are people in this book, characters, and these people talk about life and they experience life. And in that experience of life, in the experience of love, they talk about evolution, they talk about physics, they talk about philosophy, they talk about Thomas Aquinas, and in that way they find their way to God, or they try to find their way to God. So for me, so Beyond, the first book is about the perfect life, and beyond means beyond the veil of confusion that is caused by selfishness. The world is actually a very different world. And I'm describing here an individual, a woman who may have reached that state of kind of enlightenment, and how the world looks for her and how the world then responds to her. And Within is somehow the sequel, and Within for me is a vision of heaven. And the idea here is that even in the beatific vision, this learning about God will continue, and so somehow it takes forever to get to know and to love an infinite being, and this is what is so beautiful about our religion and about our life and what God has given to us.
Yeah. No, they're very, very unique books. I highly recommend both of them. And we certainly want to have you back on at some point to talk about those, because there's so much in both of those books. I know we'd love to do that at some point. So
Thank you very much.
thanks for listening to this episode of the Catholic Scientist Podcast, sponsored by the Society of Catholic Scientists. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing. And you can also show your support by donating to the Society to help us produce content like you just heard. You can donate by going to our website at catholicscientist.org and clicking on the donate button. You can also find other useful resources, articles, and videos on our website.